Okay, I'll begin. So, good afternoon. It's great to have you here for the final panel of the day. As most of you know, I'm Patrick Mann, one of the co-curators of the project. So this panel is on land, plants, and environment. And in the book, there's actually a conversation on land and mapping. And there's another conversation on plants and environment. And so we put together some of the people that participated in those respective conversations. And I think one of the things that probably you will hear running through some of the discussion is obviously the relationship between land, plants, and questions of environment. But I think one of the things that also was increasingly clear that talking about the environment is a kind of construction that sometimes actually avoids questions of land and who has jurisdiction over it. So I think one of the things that we're trying to do in a conversation like this is break some of that down. I'm thrilled that we have the panel we have, and including I want to welcome Higuanameta Laura Ramirez, who is, I will be introducing later, but is a really important staff person at Western's Office for Indigenous Initiatives at the Wampum Learning Lodge, and has some great connections to some of the work that we've been doing. So with that, I am going to, what do I do next? I am going to just introduce Jeff Thomas, and he will begin by talking about his work. And after that, I'll introduce Higuanameta Laura Ramirez. And after that, we'll welcome Ron Benner, and then Ashley Snook, and then Michael Farnan, and then we'll come up here for a conversation. And then following that, I need to say, we are going to be wrapping up fairly quickly. Chuck has another life other than keeping us alive here, and he needs to leave at 5:15, and we can't do anything without him. So we will be wrapping up by 5:15, although you'll be allowed to drink water and hang out if you want to. So I am so proud to introduce my colleague, friend, collaborator, Jeff Thomas, who's an urban Iroquois, self-taught photo-based storyteller, writer, public speaker, and curator living in Ottawa, Ontario. And his work is in major collections in Canada, the US, and Europe, and he's the holder of a Governor General's Award in Visual Arts. So Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Patrick, and good afternoon to everybody. I wish that I could be there with you and to take part. Today has been especially invigorating for me, listening to all the presenters and feeling that there's so many things that I want to talk about. So now I have to kind of clear my pathways and think about speaking about my own work, which is kind of an acquired skill because I don't like to speak about myself necessarily. I don't mind if other people do it, but that's my role as an exhibiting artist. So I'll do my best to talk about the work that I produced for this project. And I should say that it was interesting for me because I began as Patrick's co-curator and not thinking about what kind of work I would contribute to the exhibition. It was getting close to a year before the exhibition opened, I think, that I had to start putting together what I would include in the exhibition. I should probably also say that I've used the term urban Iroquois for a number of years to really be introduced as a person who was trying to create a conversation about what Indigenous people in urban centers face. And this was the bulk of my work. I am a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. I am Onondaga, and I also carry my grandfather's name, Hahats-Ta, which is a Cayuga name. And but our names are handed down from generation to generation, and my grandfather's name hadn't been taken up, so I decided that it was time for me. Essentially, it means building a pathway through the bush, and that is what I'm doing. My grandfather left Six Nations along with my mother's family as well. I moved to Buffalo in the mid-1940s, as a lot of people from Six Nations did at the time, to find work. And so I was a first generation born and raised. My grandfather, who was the only member of my immediate family who carried on the Longhouse ways, whose first language was Cayuga, he died 2 weeks before I was born. He was trying to live long enough to greet his first grandchild, and he didn't make it. But I think we touched in another way that has been a profound guidance in my life to pick up and to address the issues that led to his untimely death, and to make it into something that I think he would have guided me and helped me had he been here, whereas the other men in my family weren't interested in the same traditions. But that's another story. For this project, I began looking at what's been important to me, and it was when I was growing up. I was fortunate after my parents' divorce to live with my grandmother, Clara Thomas, who's also from Six Nations, and she took over the role of raising me and my brother. And it was through her that I started going back and forth to the reserve, to the Longhouse community. My elder, Emily General, was my teacher, my great aunt. Bert General was my step-grandfather and the person that taught me how to see clearly. And my training wasn't done in a traditional way of how in the Longhouse, because they kind of persuaded me not to take part in Longhouse ceremonies. That's another story that I won't go into now, but maybe at another time. But I learned how to see and engage in the world from a perspective of people who lived by the precepts of the Great Law, who understood the Truro Treaty. These things were instilled in me and would eventually lead to a part of my practice in terms of how do we engage with community, how do we build friendships, how do we build alliances, and how are we going to get through this mess that was brought over when Turtle Island was invaded by Europeans. This is what we're doing. This is the idea that that is a pillar of my work, and this is what I was taught. So in this sense, the work that the first work that you see here is based on the what was taking place in the town of Caledonia, just outside of Six Nations, and the image of the house there with the paintings on it is the site that the resistance site, I'll call it, that the people from Six Nations took up in preventing developers from developing and producing a new living housing for people in the area. And it was land that the Six Nations said that had never been sold to anybody. So this started a clash between the people at Six Nations and the people from Caledonia. When I was growing up, my step-grandfather used to take me into Caledonia, and we used to go to the racetrack and go into the stables, and he talked to the old-timers there. And I listened to those stories, and it wasn't so much about what they were saying, but it was the fact that my step-grandfather was engaging with non-Indigenous people. And I learned that throughout him as a farmer. He had friendships outside of the reserve with other farmers and that. So, and then my great aunt, Emily General, was an activist as well. She was a teacher on the reserve. She developed a theater company that put on plays that looked at important Haudenosaunee figures from the past. And she really was kind of anti-residential school, mush hole activist during her time, as well as with the land claims that were ongoing. So that's what that house represents to me. And And also, too, the role of corn and using corn as a symbol that my step-grandfather had showed us one year just in braiding corn together, and how important that lesson was in using the three strands and binding them together for drying and for preservation, and just how important the role of corn has been in our survival in the early times of being invaded by colonial armies, and where it led to how we survived and the role that corn played in that. And even going farther back in time to the 11th century, to the 10th century, when we were first being introduced to corn from the South. Corn equals life is this panel here, and essentially the three photographs that are in the center in black and white represent the early corn husk series that I made at my grandparents' home. The photograph on the left-hand side is Mrs. Fish, who was approached by anthropologists from the Geological Survey of Canada in 1949, who was Marius Barbeau, who was looking for corn at Six Nations. And he photographed her with the corn that he purchased. The photograph on the far right is life in the sense that this is a cradle board. This was a photograph made by Edward Curtis, who was a well-known photographer in the early 20th century who documented tribal people in the North American West. And I utilize historical photographs in my practice in terms of placing them within a new context and bringing them out into a new conversation about their role in society today. Next slide. So these two panels were in the main exhibition area, in the introduction area. And I also wanted to take the opportunity to explore something new that I hadn't done before, which was an installation work and a collaboration with Ron Benner. And I had photographed one of Ron's pieces in Gatineau many years ago. And I always thought that I'd love to do a work with him, and especially in terms of how he utilizes food photographs in his outdoor displays on this fencing, trellis fencing that he uses. So what I did is I borrowed a chair from the Museum London collection. And what I wanted to do was to bring into this sense of looking at the river and waiting for the delegates to arrive, basing it on the historical role of the confluence, and also looking at the artists coming and the writers and everybody involved with the project coming to the museum and waiting for them and thanking them for coming to the museum to make this exhibition possible. I borrowed from Ron 2 of his fences and in my own way put up photographs on here. The top one on the left-hand side is the photograph of the icon from the early environmental movement in the 1970s with the Ironized Cody, who was not an Indian, and along with one of my figurines called Chief Red Robe looking over the Ottawa River. I'm afraid that I might be going over time or that my voice might be breaking up, but the relationship here with these photographs is if Ron and I had not had the plug pulled by COVID, I wanted to have this in relationship to his garden, which is below the window as well. And the photographs on the right-hand side represent corn and tobacco that Ron had sent to me to use for the installation. And so I think just a very quick overview of the work I had in the collection for the exhibition. This is it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. So Jeff, not only did the Creator make you a great artist, but you got a great voice. I wish Jeff was just doing what I'm doing. So next I'm going to introduce Higuanameta Laura Ramirez Sanchez. She is, they are from Taino Métis, is Taino Métis from Quisqueya, the Dominican Republic, and also Keewatin, Kenora, Ontario. Laura is Biawasia, or two-spirit in the Taino language, and a land-based radical force of change. Other than spending time in the garden, Laura enjoys actively dismantling the colonial system. Laura is also, as I told you, on staff at the Wampum Learning Lodge at Western, and we're really thrilled to have her here today.
Higuanameta Nindijnakas, Taino Métis and Dao, Baiwesa and Dao, Kiskea I Kiwait Kenora Nandonjaba. My name is Laura. This is a picture of a garden lot that some friends at a government laboratory in London were very gracious enough to allow me to rematriate. I got brought on to be a Indigenous consult, which is a commonality for our people. And they wanted to understand more about how they could indigenize their very sterile STEM laboratory. So we were learning and discussing, and elders and conversations brought us to a realization that we didn't know where to start. And then I got some seeds from someone, and I thought that it was kind of a blessing. And I realized that Creator gave me these seeds to start this garden. So I started this garden of traditional white corn. A very good friend of mine, Samantha Dox-Tater, also loves to remind me that corn is the only plant product on the market. It's in the stocks. That's corn. So clearly, capitalists have seen the value in it. Why can't everybody else? I also love to remind people that are all rah-rah about native pollinators, as they should be, but these are also our key medicines. And we just need to be able to have that knowledge to use these medicines. They're all around us as we walk around. We just need to know how to identify them and how to use them in a respectful way. But because Indigenous peoples and culture and knowledges hasn't been respected and protected, a lot of these knowledges have fallen by the wayside. So there's that. And as you can see, I'm not an artist. I'm probably the only artist that, I'm not an artist that, I was brought onto this panel. I'm a gardener. I'm a landscape artist, I guess you could say. Next slide. Because I love to take community garden lots and turn them into learning experiences. I have everything labeled in my garden. I have everything labeled also in the languages of the regions, in the Ojibwe language for myself, but the Lenape and Oneida languages for my friends and family members who are also in the garden with me. I think that this use of land is so much more important than a new grocery store or any other, like the Coves, a paint factory, or something really detrimental to the environment. We can be doing something beautiful and wonderful and building community with so many different people and so many different avenues. This community garden lot is in Western, in the heart of the university. But this is actually how I met Michelle Wilson. The visual arts department has a small lot in the community garden where they grow different plants to be used for dyes. And I didn't know this. I was like, oh, that's a really beautiful plant. That's kind of interesting. And then I learned from someone else who had the knowledge that I didn't have. And that felt kind of interesting to me. To be using a plant in a natural way as an Indigenous person may use it, but they're not Indigenous, right? So I thought about how to mobilize knowledge as best as we can. And through that came designing gardens with utility. I want people to walk through a garden and be able to identify every single thing, every single being in that garden, and also to know that they can consume it in a safe and respectful way. We talk about the rule of thirds. It's oddly very similar to the one dish, one spoon wampum. Take only what you need leave the dish clean, and always leave something for someone else. Those are also the same 3 rules that we use in foraging. So I always think of these confluences, right? And how beautiful that can be. Next slide. And like I said, every garden space, aside from being a work of art, a radical work of art, brings us together. This used to be just a grass patch in a government facility laboratory. And now it's a wonderful learning space, home to the White Corn Project, which is very integral to bringing back Tuscarora white corn to the southwestern Ontario region. And alone, I have so many wonderful stories that I can share, but they're not my stories. As you heard, I'm not from this general region, but I can help mobilize this knowledge in any way that I can. And gardening is it's really fun to do also, but it's not just farting around in the garden. It's trial and error. It's troubleshooting. It's sometimes screwing up, just like art is. But it's also where the magic can happen. I love trading seeds. I love meeting new friends who also love to garden. I love meeting new friends from Indigenous communities that can trade seeds with me and discuss different grow zones and have that knowledge and say, well, this plant can be used for this anti-inflammatory reason, or this plant can be used to dye this certain fabric. It's about giving us the space to make art. That's what decolonization is to me. That's what indigenization is to me. I think there's one more slide, but I'm not sure. No, that's it. Okay, good. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Laura. Totally inspiring. Ron Benner is an internationally recognized German-Canadian artist whose long-standing practice that includes mixed media installations investigates the history and political economy of food cultures. Ron originally studied agricultural engineering at the University of Guelph. However, he found himself ethically opposed to industrial agriculture and bioengineering, so he began to travel and research the politics of food. His work is shown widely in Canada and internationally, and is also just outside our window. So please welcome Ron.
Yesterday I told the coordinating editor of the Embassy Culture House, Olivia Masuto, that if she was nervous about talking publicly, bring a prop. So I brought 2 props. I'm not going to show you the one right now. You see this one. So first of all, I'd like to thank Jeff Thomas and Patrick Mann for including me in the project GardenShip and State. And it was, I guess the best part of it for me was working with Jeff and sending him boxes of food in the mail. He didn't know what he was going to get, and I sent him a huge box of stuff from my garden, and then he was able to use the corn cobs, and the tobacco, of course. But I have brought this artifact, and I'd like to, like for instance, Ruth Skinner mentioned radical artifacts from the writing of Paul Sualas, I think it is. This, to me, is a radical artifact. And it's like a cultural deposit. It's an Eiffel Tower made from tin cans, which I purchased in 2001 in a store in Paris, France, which sold cultural products from former French colonies in Africa: Sudan, Senegal, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, and of course, Mali, which is where this is from. And the tin cans tell me that the contents were grown in Mali, the tomato, and canned in the capital city of Bamako. That's what it says on the Eiffel Tower. Now, this is a small version. There's 6-foot versions as well in this store in Paris, France. I couldn't bring the big one home at the time, so I brought a small one, which I included in an installation I did called Meeting Room. Now, so the contents were tomatoes. This is my second artifact. Radical. This is a radical artifact. Now, so we've got the one voyage of this artifact coming from Mali, which 1,000 years ago was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, to Paris, France, being bought by a gringo, foreigner, and then taken back to the Americas, to London, Ontario, where I included it in my work. Now, what's missing from this story is the tomato. Because the tomato, the one I brought, which I got from the kitchen here, is called a Roma tomato. Roma meaning from Rome. Now, the Romans never had tomatoes. Neither did the people of Mali until 500, maybe 450 years ago. When the tomato entered the economies of Mali and France eventually, it changed everything. Because what happened was the food economies of the Americas, the horticulture of First Nations entered the world economy, and the population of Africa, Europe, and Asia went way up because of tomatoes, because of potatoes, because of maize, cashews, avocados, you name it. At the same time, the population of the Americas dropped because they no longer had access to their land. And people talk about diseases being the cause of 50 million people dying. No, it wasn't that at all, because most people can survive a disease if they're well fed, but they didn't have access to their land. So my story then is a lot different. Now, as a quasi-agronomist and a quasi-scientist, I brought a clipboard to prove I might be a scientist. The tomato comes from a family called Solanaceae, genus Solanum. It's related to tobacco. It's related to eggplant, but it's native to the Americas. The species that I'm holding is called Solanum lycopersicum L. Linnaeus, you know, the Swedish guy. Bit of a racist, that one. Now, origin. Where did this originate from? Peru. And then it moved north into Central America, what's now called Central America, and into Mexico. Where does the word come from? Tomate comes from Mexican, nahuatl. It's called jitomatl in their language. Dispersion. How did it get to these other places like Mali, for instance? Well, post-Columbus or Colon, it moved from Mexico to Europe, but people didn't like it there. But it went to Africa quite quickly, not because of the Spanish, but because of the Portuguese. The Portuguese moved most of the food crops of the Americas over a period of 100 years into Africa, in India, Southeast Asia, and China. In 100 years, all these crops that were native to the Americas moved en masse And that's why the population increased. There was so much great food to eat. Now, and that, I call that post-Cabral, because Cabral was the Portuguese idiot who bumped into Brazil on his way to India, right after Da Gama in 1500. Now, the world production of tomatoes. The world production is 161.8 million tons. Largest producers, China and India, and then the United States. Genetic modification, Celgene Corporation. They made a flavor saver tomato that you could actually bounce, but it had no taste. Commercially unavailable because it was a failure. So it was never genetically modified successfully, in quotes. And finally, plant remains in association with Native American cultural deposits 5,000 years before the present. 5,000 years ago, the horticulturalists of the Americas produced edible tomatoes. 9,000 years ago, they produced maize, edible, what we call corn. It was a revolution, the same way that there was a revolution in Mesopotamia or Southeast Asia 10,000 years ago. And what seems to be forgotten is that, for me anyways, the greatest horticulturalists, not farmers, horticulturalists were Native Americans. They grew more food than anyone worldwide. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ron, as always. Ashley Snook is an interdisciplinary artist and researcher with a practice that examines interconnectivity between human and non-human animals and vegetal botanical life through drawing, installation, and sculpture. So her current studio-based doctoral research investigates the notion of animality to problematize a spectrum of human-centric, sociocultural, and scientific frameworks that have enabled rampant environmental degradation, racial injustice, and destructive human and animal relationships. So welcome, Ashley.
Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me okay? It's down, short. So in the discussion of relationality, I should probably talk a bit about my own subjective or personal history in the more than human world. I'm a white settler, and I am from a very small rural town in northern Ontario, population between 1,500 and 2,000 people. So this is before I moved to Toronto in my adult life, and yeah, it was and is a quaint spot. We don't have a grocery store in town, so my mother is an avid seamstress and shares a passion in mending socks like you do, Jamie. My father is a retired welder and fisherman and hunter. So I very much grew up eating what we had in our surroundings. Yeah, this is also notably stolen land on Nipissing First Nations. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm going to stick to my notes here. While there are many historical, political, theoretical, and practical definitions of colonialism, a key feature is an uneven power relation between individuals who are indigenous to land and those who are settlers, and this speaks directly to the ongoing Indigenous genocide in Canada. In relation to the thematics I address in my project, this shares an interesting tension and history with the categorizing of plants as invasive species. And when it comes to the escalating environmental crisis, the need for settler harm reduction, that being models that attempt to reduce the harm or risk of specific practices, is vital. So for GardenShip and State, I created a video installation entitled The Honey is Sweet, which focuses on challenging the term invasive species. The Honey is Sweet explores the colonial history and growth patterns of one of the foremost deemed invasive plant species in Canada, Phragmites australis, and is a species native to Eurasia. Also known as common reed and elephant grass, the presence of invasive Phragmites poses an ongoing threat to biodiversity in Canada and reflects the pervasive impact of colonial expansion and industrial processes on southwestern Ontario's native vegetation and endangered species. So the title of this work is essentially another way to say ignorance is bliss, and it points to the reason why invasive Phragmites ended up in Canada in the first place: overindulgence in commodity transportation. Just a side note, and information on the title. So Bashkir honey is one of the most expensive honeys in the world, and it too comes from Eurasia, or most specifically from Russia. Its color can be seen casted over the installation, as well as the color is also seen in the pesticides that is used to control the Phragmites population. So The Honey is Sweet traces my journey through overgrown Ontario wetlands on the Truxer machine here, which I rode on the side of it, holding on for dear life, going through a swampy area. So it's a Phragmites control vehicle that cuts and removes biomass. In tracing the colonial history of the plant's arrival in Canada and investigating current treatment methods, The Honey is Sweet invites viewers to question environmental decision-making in favor for a more inclusive and informative strategies of controlling these such invasive species. So in this video, I use a mock documentary style of sharing information, and I trace the colonial history of Phragmites, and I think I will just share the text that goes along, just to get right into it. So the text as follows. The European subspecies of common reed, Phragmites australis, is one of the foremost invasive plant threats to native biodiversity in Canada. Major impacts of invasive Phragmites include displacing and replacing native vegetation and eliminating habitats of endangered species. The first Canadian record of invasive Phragmites is from the Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia in the early 1900s. They would have arrived by ship from their native home in Eurasia. By 1950, the distribution of invasive Phragmites was deemed widespread. By this time, distribution patterns of invasive Phragmites were recognizable from 4 locations, 3 of which were high-traffic seaports. Phragmites spread through wind, water, and human and animal disturbance. Between 1991 and 2010, there were substantial increases in distribution, especially along highways, which connected Phragmites regions in St. Lawrence and southwestern parts of Ontario. Root systems of invasive Phragmites can reach a depth of 2 meters and can extend onto gravel shoulders where they are broken up and transported by construction equipment. Increasing numbers of roads and traffic will continue to contribute to the increasing rate of spreading. Invasive Phragmites were likely introduced to Ontario in discarded ballast water from cargo ships and imported goods brought to Canada from various parts of the world. The species is also known as elephant grass and is believed to have been introduced with straw on trains carrying elephants and other circus animals in the early 1900s. Colonial ventures and development projects facilitated the introduction and spread of invasive Phragmites. The infiltration of invasive species is not meaningfully and purposefully acknowledged in dominant discourses as a colonial process that continues to this day. Current control methods include herbicide treatment, cutting and removing biomass, and prescribed burning, all of which are required to be done over the course of many growing seasons to effectively suppress its growth. Dominant discourse on environmental hazards has traditionally been Eurocentric and based in Western scientific models and ways of knowing. As a result of Westernized environmental governance, other methods of management have been left out of hegemonic environmental discourses, such as traditional ecological knowledge. We must consider ways environmental decision-making and processes can be decolonized for more informative and inclusive strategies. The honey is sweet. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And Michael Farnan is a multidisciplinary artist educator, and he holds a PhD in art and visual culture from Western. Michael's work addresses settler-based decolonizing strategies centered on disrupting and unsettling Canada's history of colonialism and dominant Eurocentric ideologies of place and space. Michael's work has been shown widely in Canada, including recently in a solo exhibition at the McLaren Art Centre. Michael.
Thanks, Patrick. And thank you, everyone. It's pretty wonderful to be here. I made a few notes just to get myself talking about my practice. I've been kind of separated from my studio practice for a little while. And so I think what I'd like to just kind of start by saying is my work is, it stems from a struggle, I think, between production and process. I think a lot of artists probably feel that way. And when I say process, I mean sort of the big conceptual ideas. For me, ideas of decolonization, the environment. And I think it's trying to find a balance between working life, family life, and being in place, the places that we inhabit and all that encompasses that. So as an artist, that's sort of my jumping off place, to think about the places and spaces that I'm in, and where I am in relation to those places. So in response to that, I've built an art practice that sort of takes on current events, the place I'm in, and invitations like this. And I think I should say that all of us built this show and the works in it during COVID and the pandemic. My work was really a response to being, most of my work up until 2020 was very collaborative, a process of bringing people together over an idea, creating visual studio-based work, but performances and videos, and in the process of having to plan for this work and use some money already given to us in different ways, I had to kind of think about how to just look at my work in the immediate and in the place that I inhabit, which for me really turned into really looking at my home on Georgian Bay, and really starting to understand, and I guess this work is from my home in Georgian Bay, which is Victoria Harbour. It's up in Midland, and thinking about the distance between there and London, and just starting this kind of big mapping process. It's really just kind of a research wall that I just kind of unpack. A lot of the research is in books. A lot of it is in stories. Walking the land, talking to people, yeah. And so that's sort of how my practice is starting to develop, this sort of mapping and documenting the spaces that I inhabit, mostly as an act of understanding and building community, and sort of really expressing and exploring these ideas of love and hope in these environments, I think. I don't know if you want to go forward. So, you know, as a settler-based artist, and I'm an import into the Georgian Bay area, I grew up out west. My wife and family are Métis from Drummond Island. And so a lot of my understanding of that place is through stories. It's also through unpacking the settler labor. Particularly my interest is a lot of industry and labor history. That's sort of my upbringing. That's how I've kind of understood a lot of the environments I inhabit. And so, so those are the kind of histories I explore, doing sort of deep dives into understanding the treaty history. And the way my work has developed now, and there's one piece in the on-site review, is looking into this idea of what we like to say now is the non-human, and understanding in the Georgian Bay area in particular, for me, the life of the plants and animals that are inhabiting those spaces, and particularly the endangered ones. And I think the last slide, and this is a work, I'm starting to work from this work into drawing. But the other thing I did through COVID, it's sort of what got me through financially, through a lot of loss of work, was tree planting. I kind of resurrected a tree planting career. And so this particular video that I made is from the East Kootenays around Kimberley, the Rocky Mountain Trench. And since 1997, I've been working by this pulp mill in Skookumchuck, and noticed some pretty wonderful things that happen during certain weather patterns. Like there's something called an inversion, where the smoke from the pulp mill stays low in the valley and blends between the clouds, and you just end up in this kind of foggy sort of zone. But if you can come above it, you see the mountains. And so having spent most of my life in these industrial spaces, I look for beauty in them, and ways that we can maybe kind of progress out of them in some way. So yeah, that's where that work stems. And it also came from also rethinking my art practice and rethinking my video practice in particular, which was quite narrative-based, quite collaborative, and having to sort of isolate and think about how do I make a work on my own. Something I'm still kind of working on and processing through. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
So next slide. Before I ask the participants to come up and we'll have a conversation, I'll show you a little bit of my work fairly quickly. So I did a series for our exhibition, which is called Threshold Flags, and they're kind of purposefully hard to see at a distance. So I was thinking, yesterday somebody referred to our being at a kind of apex moment, and obviously in relation to our environmental crisis, in relation to some of the sort of social strife that we're also aware of. And so I had been thinking of sort of threshold moments. And next slide. And so I asked Jeff Thomas if I could actually make a work that refers to his image of Caledonia, the Caledonia protest site that he showed you a detail of in his wampum piece, the first one that he showed you. And all of the works that I made, well, these three and others that I've been working on and considering, they all have flags at a kind of moment of what might be considered kind of passage. And as somebody who comes from a printmaking background, I can tell you how these are done, but I wouldn't exactly call these prints. But I'm really aware of the sort of graphic tradition of emblematizing, symbolizing, and how significant flags and these kind of symbols of culture have become at moments of, well, obviously acquisition or colonization, but even other kinds of moments that we might consider to be appropriately challenging and transitional. And so this particular image, and I have some close-ups of one of the other images, but this particular image for me really represented a moment of import that was also, for me, the fact that some of this is unresolved, a lot of this is unresolved, suggests that this is a kind of transition in which we're all implicated. And so some of the other images in this series have a similar challenge to the viewer about, where we locate ourselves in relation to these moments of transition. So the next one. So this is even harder to see. This is actually a flag on the back of the model of the Nonsuch, which was a replica ship that's in the Manitoba Museum, and it was built for the so-called 300th anniversary of the Hudson Bay Company in 1970. And I have a long story around this, having worked on it as a 16-year-old laborer, thinking that this was a celebratory kind of artifact, and of course, coming to understand a very different kind of history. So this is the Bay's flag on the back of the ship. And if you go to the last slide. And you can see that basically what I've done is carve out the image into mat board, and then it's kind of highlighted with kind of pearlescent watercolor. And then there's this dot pattern, which kind of makes us think of printed matter, I guess. And so there's a sense in which, as said, these images are hard to kind of hold together, and purposefully so. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll ask everybody to come up to the stage. We seem to have lost Jeff, but he's still there. So Jeff, if you're there... And you are, hooray. So if everybody would come up to this stage, we'll have a little conversation. Thank you for coming back, Jeff.
Okay.
Not that I was worried. Okay. So thank you all very much for the presentations. I guess what I want to do is, I have a kind of a canned question which I'll read, but ultimately I sort of want to lean into some of how the kind of work you're doing came to be and why it came to be. So the question is, as artists and activists, we each take on different projects and questions. How do you think your work takes on the environmental crisis or decolonization or both? And I thought I would turn to Jeff first. Corn is obviously so significant in your work. And at the same time, when we began the project, you said, that you'd never done environmental work, especially around curating. And so I'm wondering how you kind of think now about, the work you're doing with corn specifically maybe, but more broadly about a project like this.
Well, I remember saying that, and then I thought about it, and I thought, well, no, it's always been a part of my work in one way or another. Whether it was growing up in Buffalo, New York on the west side, and coming back from the reserve and looking and comparing the two environments in terms of what they offered me, I would say that's an environmental work. It's also political, and it's also because the school that I went to, which was only a block away from me, public school number 19, that's where I had my first protest when I was in about the 5th grade, when I refused to stand for the national anthem. Back in the 60s, that's something that was required in classes and saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So these were all elements that were part of my work. And then in terms of the land itself, this is something that I learned when I would go to the reserve, and I would see my great aunt in the garden working away with her big straw hat on. I would remember my grandfather talking about putting crops in things and identifying trees and all of these different elements. And I think the juxtaposition of what I experienced on the reserve and then going back to the reality of the city was laying the seeds, I guess, for this all coming together in my work. And then with this project and looking at my work in terms of environment and the land and political activity, as I had mentioned with Caledonia, I saw that when I was opening an exhibition in Lethbridge. I was watching the news and I saw the clash between the people in Caledonia and Six Nations, and it was just one of the ugliest things that I've ever seen on TV. Same with Oka, when the people from Ganawage were going into Montreal and the French were stoning the cars of women and children that were trying to get supplies. So it was these types of images that I was horrified about, and also what I saw when I was on the streets. I was a kid, sitting on the street corner with my friends, and I was a part of the gang, and I did all of these things, and I was never arrested, but nonetheless, this was the reality of my world. And how do you take all of those experiences and bring them into some kind of conversation that didn't exist at the time? I was thinking about Quinn and answering the question about his work and questions and maybe not being prepared to answer something yet. I remember going through all of that and when I was a young artist, and it kind of hurts to say that now, but I'm 66, so that's the reality. But the idea of in the pursuit of knowledge and of finding some sort of balance in the world that we live, that's all part of the same thing. And here in GardenShip and State, I began to see, just in terms of my friendships and working with other artists in our Zoom talks, which is something that was just one of the best parts of working on this project, and learning about artists and speaking freely. These were all part of that experience of how do we begin to open up those lines of communication.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeff. Yeah, it's a number of things you said there, and something you didn't say, but you alluded to, is that somehow photography seemed to be a way to bring a lot of that complexity together, and you mentioned the word balance. And I'm going to turn to you, Laura, who also works with corn, but clearly not taking photographs, although you had nice documentation of your gardens. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about, in a sense, the cultural work you're doing and the activist work you're doing through working with corn.
As I mentioned in my little intro, it's so much more than just farting around in the garden. For us, we put the seeds in our mouth and we sing those traditional songs. And then you put the seed into the ground and it's already got its antimicrobial protection from our saliva, which is very scientifically cool. And then just the happenstance skill of taking that being from a seed, then a seedling, maybe sapling, and then having it in the garden, caring for it, singing to it, nurturing it, and then having that being provide for your family is amazing. And when I can provide seed for community members and remind them that it's our ways. My grandma used to say we are the original recyclers and we're the best at it. It's building that connection from something that someone said it before, is a sentient being and needs to be respected as such. And gardening provides your spiritual, emotional, your physical, obviously, your mental care, and mobilizing that knowledge and helping others understand that it's really so much more than just a seed, or it's so much more than taking time out of my day to care and be there for this being that's going to be there for me.
Start gardening.
I used to fart around in the garden every single day with my grandmother. she grew a garden like nobody's business. And when they moved from Kenora to Toronto, she always said how trying that was for her. I mean, such a smaller bit of land, different climate, different seasonal changes, and her struggles in providing for our family with the garden every season. It got better and better, and just having fun with it too.
Thank you. That's amazing. You mentioned the word connection, and I'm thinking, Ron, you've been making connections for, 40 years across, land. And today you made connections for us around tomatoes. So do you want to talk a bit about, I guess, your work and how you do that?
Well, I'd like to sort of talk more about something else.
Okay.
And that, I grew up in a giant cover-up. So when so in public school, I learned about Native people circa 1500, let's say, in Canada, across Canada, 1500. And when I asked my father about where I came from, because I knew I wasn't a native person, he told me, "Oh, you're Danish." And then I asked my grandfather, his father, I said, I called him Curly, that was a nickname. I said, "Curly, where did we come from?" He said, "Oh, we were English, but actually we were Scottish, and that's why I played the bagpipes." That's what he did as a musician. And I thought, oh, okay, so my grandfather thinks we're Scottish, my father thinks we're Danish, and then when I was 16 years old, my grandfather got a legal document sent to him by a lawyer from Kitchener telling him that he had to, they wanted him to give up the water rights to a creek flowing into the Grand River. And my grandfather said, "Oh yeah, well, what's that all about?" He said, "Well, they want to pay you a lot of money for the water rights." And then I said to my grandfather at that time, I said, so where did these water rights come from? He said, "Well, I think it had something to do with the German side of the family." And I went, "The German side of the family?" He said, yeah. They came up from Pennsylvania. And I forgot to tell you about that. And I said, "When did they come up from Pennsylvania?" He said, "Oh, 1820. And I said, 1820? Well, who are the Scottish people?" "Oh, they didn't come till later." And so then I learned this whole history of the Swiss German side of my family who came up from Pennsylvania. And so it was a giant cover-up because of the First and Second World War. Just a massive cover-up. And then the more I looked into, not a genealogy, I hated navel-gazers, but I was interested in why, okay, if they can cover that up, what else is covered up? Like this 1500 idea of First Nations. And that's when I started to look around. And that's when I started to travel. And the more I traveled in the Americas, the more I realized that we had been essentially lied to in our educational system. And so when people talk about decolonization, for me, it had to do with an educational system that was purposed so that you weren't educated about the past. Totally. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. That was way better than what my question was leading you to. So actually, decolonization, we've been talking about that. Also cover-up. It seems like there's something about a kind of cover-up that blaming the plants, which we often do, is involved with. So can you talk a little bit about basically the whole invasive species project and whatever else you want to talk about?
Yeah. Yeah, the term invasive species has always been a perplexing concept to me, even as a child, because, quickly did I realize that the invasiveness comes from how destructive humans can be. And we do the displacement of other species. So I guess in my learning of the Phragmites, I traveled along with a team of volunteers who graciously, help out our biodiversity. And I want to speak very highly of, that initiative because that's amazing. But at the same time, a lot of, literature about invasive Phragmites there's not an accountability there that's really required. And that was my focus and main interest in this specific project, but also deeming a species as invasive. There's just such a huge gap in accountability that I really enjoy picking at and making people uncomfortable with, because really that's, being passive about something like that is just so destructive.
Thank you. And earlier, Jeff referred to the importance of speaking the truth. And it seems to me that you're using your art project to tell the truth over and against the idea that we might have thought there was nothing wrong with the system that would have made it possible for this kind of destruction to happen. So, Michael, with your work, which seems to me to be very invested in decolonization, you've used humor, your maps are beautiful. So I'm interested in that kind of connection between sort of knowledge and telling the truth and being critical, but also the way you go about it.
Yeah, thanks. I think some of the ideas talked about are ways to kind of enter into that. Like Ashley, I think accountability and uncovering the truth and these sort of stories that Ron brought up, and these ideas of gardening and being connected to the land. I think they're the work that we should be doing. They're the work that is, in my opinion, of breaking down decolonization is less the big term of connection or community. It's just telling stories and getting to know people and just doing the work. But for me as an artist, I think one of the tools that I've sort of learned to develop is how do I get the people that I'm working with, the people that I'm showing to, how do you enter that space? And so beauty and in particular humor. I'm the child of British immigrants to this country, and I grew up with things like Monty Python and Benny Hill and these kind of things. And so
Maybe, you never know.
yeah. So for me, humor is sort of the greatest tool. Like if you can get someone to laugh, you can get them to think about an idea. And I think laughter and hope is the best way to go about tackling some of this stuff.
Thanks, Michael. Dan and Mary Lou are having to leave to be picked up, so I just want to acknowledge that they're leaving and the great contribution they made today. We only have a few more minutes, unfortunately, so I can keep this going up here, but I also could open it up if people have questions. Sean, a hard question? Maybe I'll grab one of these. Thanks.
I just wanted to respond to the story about cover-up from Ron, which I thought was very interesting. And have you been to Edmonton? Yeah. You've been to the University of Alberta? Yeah. Do you know Hub Mall?
Yes.
There's
I try to avoid it.
Yes. There's not one place.
I know Strathcona
Yes,
Market.
that's nice. But Hub Mall, I don't think there's one place to eat in there that isn't fried food. And, this is an educational institution, and it's like, this is a kind of cover-up that you're covered with batter.
Those malls, like the arcade, the history of the arcade, you know where it comes from? Prisons. Yeah, check that out.
I'll do Paul, and then I'll come to Sherry.
So I've come to my personal understanding of things is that empathy is perhaps one key way that we can move forward through some of these crises that we're facing right now. And I'm wondering, it's hard enough to empathize with the people around us, but I'm wondering what your strategies are for empathizing with other than human communities.
Anybody want to volunteer for that one, Michael?
One way that I've been forced to empathize with the human and non-human is through the clear cut, and a lifetime of working as a tree planter and seeing how, I remember growing up and seeing posters that quoted passages from the Bible of "Forgive us, thy Father, for this destruction" and things like that, and just this. And I worked for Greenpeace at one time when I was 18, and how these things are framed of these sort of soulless, dead places, but then spending, countless hours, thousands of hours in these places and seeing how life comes back to these places, but it comes back slowly, and it has to be kind of encouraged and nurtured and respected, and each animal and person that's displaced by this industry, needs its space and time. And I think empathy and understanding how the processes that we're involved in are affecting those around us, I think is key.
Thanks, Michael. Ashley, do you?
I think personally, it's based off of self-fulfilling relationships I built when I was a child, growing up very secluded from any sort of city life. My friends were chickens and cows and cats and dogs and fish and birds. Bit of an awkward child and adult. But yeah, I guess that's where the empathy built, and also the foundations of my morals from my parents who raised me in the country and raised me to work with and respect where we live.
Thank you. I think go ahead, Laura. Yep.
Yeah, okay. Over the past summer, our garden was being ransacked by gophers. And I didn't know what to do. I kept doing everything under the sun, coyote urine, cayenne pepper, everything. I went to my elder and I said, hey, we got to do something about this. This is really, I'm going to be screwed for the rest of the season. And he goes, you got to learn how to live with the fauna. He has to feed his family too, right? And I was like, dang it, okay. And then he goes, how did you design your garden? Did you design enough for the animals? I said, no. I guess that's why he's coming into, and that's human reality, right? We affected their natural habitats too, and we need to understand that and look at it in that empathetic and compassionate way of maybe that's putting 3 more rows of corn in for the raccoon and other fauna. But they support the ecosystem and everything as well, right? So it's always taking that step back. Yeah, the gophers really gave me a hard time last season, so I really needed to share that. So I'm still kind of traumatized, but yeah, whatever.
Thanks, Laura. I think we'll turn it to Sherry to ask the last question.
So I'm going to kind of connect back to something that came up in the first panel of the day. Katie showed a work of art that said land back, stories back, culture back, blank back. And she spoke about the significance of that artwork as addressing how land back had become a phrase that was being removed from its genuine meaning through the sort of trendiness of the word. And I think that we are somewhat unfortunately living through a time when decolonization is a word going through those same motions of being kind of trendy and being attached to things that you can't necessarily decolonize. And I've seen dialogue that suggests that instead, particularly for settlers, they should be talking about doing anti-colonial work. And I just, to kind of build off of where we started and kind of pull it back around as we see this word showing up a lot here today, wondered if you as panelists might have any thoughts on that, because in your panel, that word came up a lot.
Thank you.
Answer that one?
Yep.
Yeah, that's hello. So in 1992, our son Tariq Hassan Gordon, he went to university. He went to Trent, and he took Indigenous studies. He wasn't Indigenous, but he studied Anishinaabe, and he went to elders conferences there. He studied environmental courses, and then he became the editor of the student newspaper, the Arthur. And then he formed this anti-colonial, what was it called? Anti-Colonial Action Alliance. And I said to myself, holy shit, this guy's really radical. I love it. God, I haven't lost out with the guy. He's an anti-colonialist, just like me. And it wasn't until decades later, like he's a diplomat now, right? So he tries to get along with people, but he speaks truth to power still. Even though he was arrested, he went through that whole security system. But for me, as a 74-year-old, I've been through the Anti-Colonial Action Alliance, and I accepted it. But before that, I wasn't anti-colonial because I'm a colonial. So how can I be anti myself? I have to come to terms with the past and with history. And if history's being covered up, then the way out is through the truth, through what happened before. And you know, every year I learn something new about the past in what is now called Canada. I just read the Daniel Laxer's book about the music of the fur trade. An astounding book, even though it was like a doctorate kind of language, doctorate study language. I learned stuff about the sounds of the fur trade that I didn't know about. And I learned about La Cloche so it's a case of always wanting to learn. And it doesn't matter if you can say you're anti-colonial or you're decolonizing, but in reality, you're continuing to learn the truth about this land and the peoples who originated here. Okay.
Thank you, Ron. It's a really important question. It's a big question. And personally, I would like to continue. That said, I also want to respect Chuck's schedule. So I do need to wrap up the panel. And so I want to thank everybody who has given us such a generous presentation today. So Jeff, it's up to you and me to wrap this up. And I can't remember which order we said we were going to go in. But do you want me to go first?
No, I'll go first.
Okay.
I had been thinking about what people were saying during their panels, and when Jamelia was speaking, something came to mind that I thought was kind of funny, and I can't remember what stimulated it, but It was about the role of artists, and I think it's kind of intertwined with everybody and what we were talking about. And the word that came to mind is how I would describe myself is as a plumber. And it doesn't sound very exotic. It doesn't sound, like, well, it's an ordinary job, but it has something that has to be done. And it's not glorious like being an artist. But I think in a lot of ways, I've seen myself as a plumber. And what I use that word to describe is how the mind works. And how do we change perceptions that are negative in the colonial sense, in terms of how the land is viewed, politicians. And I thought about neural pathways. And how do we go in and clean those places? And how do we get the flow of information going again? I thought about residential schools and what our children went through for over a century in terms of the brainwashing, the social engineering that went on in those schools. And how do we get them to begin thinking about themselves in a good way? How do we get them to think about their community in a good way, despite all of the pain that is circulating around? And I think as artists, as communicators, that's our role, is how do we get people thinking about it in a way that is not confrontational, like as I mentioned about Caledonia. How do we get people thinking and engaged in a conversation? One time I had received an email, and it was from, I think, maybe Library and Archives or something. And they said there was this guy that was going around trying to touch base with an Indigenous person. He lived up in cottage country, and they were having problems, like they always have, between the Indigenous people in those areas and cottagers and that. And he said, we wanted to talk to the people on the reserves. How do you go about doing that? And so I thought about it, and then I thought, well, there's never a dumb question, so here's one that deserves a good answer. And I said, did you ever think about just going over to the chief's house and knocking on the door and introducing yourself and telling them who you are and that you wanted to talk about this, and do you have time for a cup of tea? And I never heard back from him. I don't know if he did that or not, but I thought, well, this is what I understood things to be when I was growing up. To be straightforward and just come out and say it, whether it's good or whatever, or if you sound stupid or you think you may sound stupid asking a question, that's where the conversation begins. And that's what our project GardenShip was about and is about. And it's a living organism. It's not just going to pass away as another exhibition put on at Museum London. Something started here, and whether or not we all embrace it in that same sense, I think over time, what we did here will be going out all over through people that participated in this project, to the people that are here today. And to use a word that I never like to use, reconciliation, what is your responsibility? It's education. And Donnie, that's all I have to say.
As always,
my microphone was on.
As always, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to just say a few thank yous, and I couldn't have said what Jeff said, so I thank him very deeply for saying that. So we need to thank all kinds of people, and I'll do this fairly quickly, but certainly the museum staff, Director Julie Bevan and Andrew Keir, Head of Exhibitions and Programs, and all of the staff, including Sidna Mercer, who's here with us today. And a special thank you to Lisa McDougall for her events planning, and Chuck Kitt. I think we should give him his own hand. And of course, Katie Wilhelm, Ruth Skinner, the Ontario Arts Council Indigenous Artists in Residence Program, SHIRK. This is obviously in no particular order. Some of our friends, Dr. Nina Zatani, Dr. Nandi Bhatia, Dr. Lewis Williams, Western's Arts and Humanities faculty, Josh Lambier, and the Words Festival, all of the great contributors to the Coves project, and that includes Oneida Nation of the Thames Brandon Dockstader, Sweet Labour London's Kevin O'Connor and Ruth Doothright, and Marshall Stonefish, Antler River Valley, Tom and Miriam, Embassy Cultural House, Jamili Ron and Olivia, Candace Dubé, and others from Atlosa. So finally, I just want to leave you with these amazing words from Indigenous biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer. We need acts of restoration, not only for polluted waters and degraded lands, but also for our relationship to the world. We need to restore honor to the way we live, so that when we walk through the world, we don't have to avert our eyes with shame, so that we can hold our heads up and receive the respectful acknowledgement of the rest of the Earth's beings. So thank you for all of your generous participation.